the Island of Dolls. The Island of Dolls, hidden in the labyrinth of canals in the southern part of Mexico City, has long been considered a place where reality and mysticism intersect. Among the decayed trees and twisted paths, hundreds of dolls hang with empty, dead eyes. This eerie corner became the home of Julian Santana Barrera, a man who for many years waged a battle with his own demons, dwelling among these creepy figurines. Julian found refuge on the island after a series of life failures. He was a simple farmer, tired of the city's hustle and human cruelty. But most of all, he was tormented by nightmares that had plagued him ever since he accidentally witnessed a horrific tragedy. One hot July night, when the sky was overcast and the moon barely shone through, Julian found the body of a little girl who had drowned in the canal. This sight was forever imprinted in his memory, and since then, he had been haunted by visions of her ghost. Every night, he heard her crying, coming from the dark corners of his humble home. The dolls he started collecting and hanging around the island seemed to only intensify her presence. He believed that these creepy dolls could appease the girl's spirit and protect him from her wrath. But it was all in vain. The girl had no intention of leaving. Julian began buying dolls at local markets, then started finding them in the trash, and sometimes people who had heard about his unusual hobby would bring them to him. Each doll was hung on the branches of trees or staked into the ground near his home. Some were eyeless. Others were without arms or legs, with charred faces or mutilated bodies. But all of them were witnesses to the nightly nightmares Julian endured in solitude. One particularly grim evening, when the wind howled as if the entire world was groaning, Julian heard her again. At first, it was a soft whisper, resembling the rustle of leaves. Then, a clear child's voice. "Julian, Julian," she called, and the sound of her voice chilled him to the bone. He rose from his bed, his hands trembling, and lit a candle. Shadows danced on the walls, creating bizarre, sinister shapes. Julian stepped outside, guided by an unknown force, and saw her. The girl stood by the water, her pale face framed by wet strands of hair, and her eyes glowed with an otherworldly light. "What do you want?" he shouted, his voice shaking with fear and despair. But she only looked at him silently, her gaze penetrating the depths of his soul. Then she raised her hand and pointed at a doll hanging on a tree near the house. Julian realized that this was the last doll he had found that morning, pulled from the canal. He approached it and saw that its eyes were as black as a void. "That doll belonged to me," she quietly said, her voice echoing in his head. Julian felt the ground slipping away beneath his feet. He tried to break free from her hypnotic gaze, but couldn't. The girl stepped closer, and in her eyes he saw everything: her fear, her pain, her despair. It was too much. His heart tightened, and losing his balance, he fell to his knees before the doll. From that day on, Julian's behavior became even stranger. He stopped talking to the rare visitors, completely withdrawing into himself and his visions. The dolls seemed to come alive at night, whispering among themselves, and sometimes their eyes began to follow him wherever he went. One ominous night, when the sky was again covered with clouds and only lightning illuminated the darkness, Julian heard her voice again. He could resist no longer. He stepped out of the house and into the inky black water of the canal. The water embraced him, pulling him into its depths. He did not fight. This was his way to find the peace he so desperately sought. His body was found the next morning, floating near the place where the girl had once been found. People said his face was calm, as if he had finally found peace. But the island of dolls remained as eerie as ever. The dolls hanging on the branches continued to stare into the void with their lifeless eyes. And in the night silence, a faint whisper could sometimes be heard, as if the very earth was telling its terrifying story to those who dared to listen. They say the Julian spirit now also dwells on this island, along with the girl and her dolls. And if you dare to visit this place, be prepared to hear their whispers in the dark and to see the empty but ever watching eyes of the dolls.